Hello, GW, and welcome to the final episode of White House Correspondents. I'm your host, Sean Lee. In today's episode, we will be taking a look at President Biden's most recent acts within the first 100 days as his period comes to a close on April 30th. President Biden recently announced that he will withdraw all troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021. This date marks the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. The Trump administration had previously attempted to negotiate a deal with the Taliban to have all troops out by May 1st, 2021. And although the Taliban announced they would renew attacks on US and NATO personnel, if the foreign troops weren't removed by that initial May 1st deadline, it is not clear if they'll follow through these threats now that Biden is planning for a phased withdrawal between now and September. There are officially 2,500 US troops stationed in Afghanistan, but the actual number fluctuates. Currently, there are 3,500 US troops and 7,000 foreign forces, with the majority being NATO troops. The decision to remove troops from Afghanistan comes after the Biden administration's review of current US options in Afghanistan, where peace talks have not been successful. The Taliban remains a powerful force, even though the US has spent 2 decades now trying to establish democratic governance. During this period, about 2,000 US troops have been killed and at least 100,000 Afghan civilians have been injured or killed. Although the Taliban is still aggressive, the US is putting its resources elsewhere in an attempt to shift the global focus from post-9/11 counterinsurgency campaigns to current priorities. These include increasing military competition with China, achieving global non-proliferation, and keeping an eye on Russia, which is increasingly aggressive. The US still plans to be diplomatically involved in Afghanistan, just not through troops on the ground. President Biden and his administration have been at high stakes the past couple of weeks due to various negotiations regarding the Iran nuclear deal. Both Iran and the US did not have direct talks, but instead discussed the matter with top European officials through diplomats sent to the Vienna conference from the US. The proposed action was to ask Iran to halt some of their nuclear developments, such as advanced centrifuges and the enrichment of uranium, to 20% purity. However, these proposals are expected to be easily rejected by Iran based on prior rejections. Another aspect to consider is the expiration date of Iran's temporary agreement with the International Atomic Agency in late May. This unofficial deadline puts pressure on the US to create a successful agreement before Iran gets its hand on more immediate nuclear technologies. With the Joint Progressive Comprehension Plan of Action expiring soon, the US must be vigilant and perform sanctions soon if they seek to limit Iran's nuclear capacity. Biden has not defined a nuclear deal as a top priority due to other domestic issues like COVID, so the US State Department has taken a role on primary negotiator. And within his first 100 days, President Biden sought to pass certain acts and implement infrastructure plans to help Americans. Here's Nicholas with an overview.
Thank you, Sean. As President Biden's first 100 days comes to a close, there will be various acts of Congress that will not reach his desk in time. Some of these acts were part of his proposed agenda before entering the White House. One of the most anticipated pieces of legislation that will be considered for passage is H.R. 1, or the For the People Act. Already passing the House of Representatives, the bill comes following the 2020 presidential election and the several unfounded disputes that have occurred around the results of the election. Furthermore, it comes at a time where over 300 bills attempting to restrict access to voting, specifically absentee ballot voting, have been introduced within state legislatures across the United States. This bill would deal with access to voting, attempt to introduce transparency and checks in terms of campaign finance, and strengthen ethics rules for public servants. Another piece of legislation to be considered for passage following the end of the first 100 days is H.R. 5, or the Equality Act. Also passing the House of Representatives, the bill attempts to introduce anti-discrimination protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. The bill comes following the historic Supreme Court decision of Bostock v. Clayton County, which decided that any employer that had fired an employee on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity would be in violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This bill comes at a time when anti-LGBTQ plus legislation is being proposed and passed within state legislatures across the country, specifically anti-transgender legislation. Finally, H.R. 6, or the American Dream and Promise Act of 2021, is another piece of legislation soon to be considered for passage. The bill, having been passed within the House of Representatives, would provide a path to permanent resident status for Dreamers, as well as persons of temporary protected status. The bill also provides other immigration-related protections, such as a grant program for nonprofit organizations that assists individuals with certain immigration-related issues, as well as a right to judicial review in the event of one's denial or revocation of temporary protected status. A similar bill had been introduced in the Senate by Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin and Senator Lindsey Graham. Recently, President Biden has announced that he will be proposing a $2 trillion plan to rebuild American infrastructure, calling it a once-in-a-generation investment in America. If successful, the plan would repair over 20,000 miles of road and 10,000 bridges, including the 10 most economically important bridges in the U.S. The funding for the plan would derive from increased corporate tax revenues over the next 15 years. Biden's plan has already faced criticism from those across the aisle, and many against the plan disagree with Biden's proposal to collect funding from taxes. Additionally, critics of this plan do not see the hundreds of billions of dollars used for research and development to be worthwhile. Those in favor, however, note that improving the U.S.'s neglected infrastructure would not only benefit all Americans, but aid against climate change, as bridges and roads would be less likely to collapse as a result of stronger storms or flooding. In addition to working on climate change, Biden claims his plan would help fight racial inequalities in the economy that were worsened by prior administration's federal spending efforts. As the infrastructure plan continues to develop, we will see if Biden is able to rally bipartisan support. Back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thanks for watching. I'm Sean Lee, and this has been White House Correspondents.